Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 42, Rose Lodge. Warning, there is some graphic information in this episode. I had a request of a different kind that formed the basis of this episode and a bonus episode. Ian Lee, a member of the Deniliquin Historical Society, suggested that I look into a family that built an historic home in Deniliquin, and it uncovered some interesting stories from not just one but two owners over the years. This episode covers the Broughton family, and the bonus episode covers the Wise family. This home was also of particular interest to me as my great-great-uncle, James Nathan Moore, known as Nat, and his wife Mary lived in this home from 1954. After Nat's death in 1979, Mary continued to live in the home until her death in 1992. Mary's twin sister Annie was a teacher at St Michael's School and lived with Mary and Nat in the home as well. And they ended up being the longest-standing owners in the home to this date. John and Isabella Broughton purchased a block of land in February 1865 that was on the corner of Macaulay and Cressy Streets, Deniliquin. By the time their child Frances was born, in August 1866, they had built a home calling it Rose Lodge. The home still exists today. So who was John Broughton and what role did he play in the town of Deniliquin? Well, his family tree proved to be quite impressive and very interesting. John Archer Broughton was born on the 11th of December 1818 at Liverpool, New South Wales, and he was the fifth child of six to William Broughton, who was an assistant surgeon on the First Fleet, and Eliza Charlotte Kennedy. His father, William Broughton, was born in November 1768 at Chatham, Kent, England, and he was the assistant surgeon to John White. He was appointed by the governor as government storekeeper at Parramatta on the 20th of February 1789. He built a brick house next to the store, and Hunter granted him 2.5 acres of land in January 1798, which he cultivated. This was at the corner of Macquarie, Harris and George Streets in Sydney. On the 12th of December 1800, Broughton was sent to Norfolk Island as a locum tenens for Zachariah Clark, the Deputy Commissioner-General who had gone to England, while Mr. William Sutter took up Mr. Broughton's duties in Sydney. In April 1804, Captain Wilson ordered Broughton to be court-martialled, but Lieutenant Governor Joseph Orveau could find no grounds for his suspension, and he recommended that the charges be dropped and Broughton reinstated. In 1805, Broughton was discharged from Norfolk Island, and on the 1st of November replaced Chapman as the Deputy Commissioner of Stores in New South Wales, earning 5 shillings a day. Between 1793 and 1807, he had 5 children by Anne Glossop, or Glassop, also known as Elizabeth Heathorn, in a common law relationship. Anne, as I'll call her in this story, was born in Kent, England in 1766 and baptised Anne Glossop on the 29th of January 1786 in Derbyshire, England. She was 2 years older than William, and she had been sentenced at Montgomery Great Sessions at Welshpool in Wales for stealing a piece of velvet from a shop and was sentenced to transportation for 7 years. She left England in June 1791 and arrived in Sydney in February 1792 as part of the Third Fleet. In 1805, she is recorded as a woman with an expired sentence off Stores, living on Norfolk Island, going by the name Anne Glossop. William Broughton and Anne Glossop's first child, Mary Ann Heathorn Broughton, was born on the 27th of February 1793 at Parramatta. Mary went on to marry Thomas Kahn in January 1816 in Sydney. The next child, Sarah Broughton, was born on the 13th of September 1799 at Parramatta, and Sarah went on to marry Charles Throsby Smith at Appin in New South Wales on the 8th of October 1822. Sarah died aged only 39 at Wollongong, New South Wales in December 1838. Their third child, William Henry Broughton, was born on Norfolk Island on the 15th of May 1802, so the assumption is that Anne Glossop followed William to the island. So William Jr. married Mary Ward at St Peter's, Parramatta on the 22nd of February 1827. Mary was born in Ireland and she came to Australia in 1814. Her usual residence on the marriage certificate was the Illawarra, and William Jr. at the time was living in Appin. William owned property that he called Broughton'sworth at Burrawa in New South Wales. They had 10 children, 3 sons and 7 daughters, and he died in Yass on the 4th of September 1858. His wife went on to live until she was 94 years old. Their next child, Rebecca Heathorn Broughton, was born on the 5th of September 1804 at Norfolk Island. She married Cornelius O'Brien from Appin on the 2nd of October 1822 at Campbelltown. And Elizabeth Isabella Broughton, known to the family as Betsy, was born in Sydney on the 5th of September 1807. She married Charles Throsby Jr. in 1824 at the age of 16, and they had 17 children, 9 sons and 8 daughters. She died at the age of 83 at Throsby Park, Bong Bong, New South Wales, in her home known as the Cottage. In 1808, William is recorded as travelling with his wife, Elizabeth Heathorn, and this is the first time that we see Anne Glossop's name as Elizabeth Heathorn, and their 4 children, travelling on the ship the City of Edinburgh from Norfolk Island to Van Diemen's Land. They arrived in Van Diemen's Land on the 2nd of October 1808. Anne Glossop sailed for England in October 1809 on the Boyd, commanded by Captain John Thompson with their youngest child Elizabeth, known to the family as Betsy. En route, the ship called into New Zealand at the Bay of Islands. John Thompson proceeded to Whangaroa Harbour to obtain spars. For these he applied to the natives, who promised help, but suggested that he should accompany them to a particular site. Accordingly, leaving a part of his crew on board, overhauling and repairing the rigging, Thompson and his chief officer, with either 2 or 3 boats manned, were prevailed upon to leave their ship and accompanied the natives to their canoes. This was on the second morning after their arrival. Up to that time, everything had been friendly, without any signs of disturbances. Early in the morning, Chief Tipperhee himself had arrived, where he did not stay very long, but remained in his canoe alongside the ships, accompanied by a crowd of natives gathering, apparently for trade. Many others had boarded the vessel and were sitting about on the decks. Captain Thompson and his crews in the boats were conducted by the Maoris up a river well out of sight of the ship and invited to land and to select their spars. They did so and were led through the woods, ostensibly to examine the spars, but in reality to allow time for the tide to ebb, thus leaving the boats high and dry and useless for escape. The natives then became insolent and rude, claiming to Captain Thompson that he maltreated some of them and told him plainly that all the spars he would have to cut down himself. Thompson did not appear much concerned at his failure, but with his men turned back towards the boats. Then the attack began. Sudden and swift, the Maoris produced clubs and axes concealed behind their robes. Though the boat's crew possessed several muskets, so impetus was on the onset that they were all cut down before they had a chance to fire a shot. Thompson and the entire boat's crews were murdered on the spot, and, said the chronicler, their bodies were afterwards devoured by the murderers. Clothing themselves in the white men's apparel, the Maoris waited till the tide rose in the evening, launched the boats and returned to the ship. On arrival it was fairly dark. The second officer, unsuspicious, hailed the boats, the crew of which said they had brought a load of spars, but that the captain and his men had decided to camp ashore. Accordingly, the natives came on board, immediately killing the second officer, who was the only one there to bar their progress. Apparently, too, there was some collaboration with those natives who were still on board the ship. Some of the Maoris went down to the cabin where a few of the passengers had taken refuge and ordered them on deck to see the spars. One woman was killed going up the cabin ladder, and the others, some of whom were already in bed, ventured out to discover the cause of the disturbance and were in turn slain, all except 4 or 5 who climbed up the rigging where they remained all night in terror. Early the next morning, Tipperhee appeared alongside the ship. According to one account, he seized a speaking trumpet and ordered the refugees up in the shrouds to come down, promising them that if they did so, they would not be hurt. When they did so, they were carried ashore, slain at once, and after their arms and legs had been cut off, were roasted and eaten. According to the report of Captain Gwynn given to Captain Chase, Tipperary returned to the Boyd, took possession, plundered the vessel, and then burnt her to the water's edge, the tops then remaining above water. In the Sydney Gazette of the 1st of September 1810, we get another slant on the story. There it is asserted that Tipperary was allowed by the Wangaroans to take away 3 boatloads of goods, but no firearms or gunpowder, that the salt provisions, flour and spirits were thrown over as unpalatable, that the bulk of the rest was divided amongst them in their anxiety to secure muskets, and one of them exploded over a cask of gunpowder, killing 5 native women and 8 or 9 men. Anne Glassop was amongst most of the passengers and crew that were massacred. 2-year-old Betsy, 2 other children and a woman were spared. It was more than 3 weeks amongst the savages, suffering incredible hardships before they were rescued. The city of Edinburgh had docked, and accompanied by his chief officer, James Russell, Mr. Alexander Berry, supercargo, and Matangaro, a friendly chief of the Bay of Islands, arrived on the 31st of December 1809, and they had 3 armed boats in the Wangaroa harbour, where they found the miserable remains of the Boyd, stripped of everything of value and burnt down to the water's edge. Mr. Berry boldly entered into the harbour, the crew of which were armed, and proceeded in getting 2 of the principal chiefs of the district into his possession. One of them he dispatched in search of the child. The other he kept as a hostage, whom he threatened with instant death if the child was not produced in a given space of time. In a few hours, the agreeable astonishment of Mr. Berry, she was produced, and although the child was in a very emaciated state, it still afforded him much pleasure, as she was the daughter of his friend, and by the intrepidity and courage of this worthy man saved the child's life. About the later end of January or beginning of February 1810, Mr. Berry took his departure from New Zealand, bound for England, but the boat was damaged at Cape Horn and had to be diverted to Peru. After encountering various perils and hardships, he arrived at Lima safe. He there discharged his cargo and repaired the ship, but this took 11 months. In this time, Betsy was looked after by the family of Don Gaspardi Rico. Once the boat was seaworthy, he sailed for Rio de Janeiro, at which place he fell in with a British brig called the Atlanta, bound for New South Wales. He placed Betsy on board this brig, and she arrived in safety about the latter end of May in 1812, to the great joy of her disconsolate father. In gratitude, Broughton had a portrait painted of the child and sent to Don Rico and his family, along with Broughton's letter. Strange as her story, it had an equally improbable sequel. In the 1950s, a New Zealand art dealer and collector, Rex Nankivel, who lived in London, noticed a portrait of a young girl dressed in 19th century costume in a second-hand shop in England. He bought it, and when the picture was removed from its frame, he found a letter. And the letter was Broughton's letter that the family obviously either read and kept inside the frame or didn't know that the letter even existed in the frame. The letter says, "Tribute of respect and grateful remembrance for as nobly distinguishing themselves by their humanity in their protection and benevolent treatment of the child during her residence at Lima for 11 months, and deems itself honoured in subscribing itself. Then most obliged, grateful, obedient and devoted humble servant, William Broughton, Sydney, New South Wales, 8th of April 1814. When Rex Nankivel bought that framed picture from the second-hand dealership in London, it was 150 years from the time that that framed picture was sent over to Lima. It now is in the care of the Australian National Library in Canberra. In 1976, he was advised by letter of the acquisition of Elizabeth's or Betsy's home, Throsby Park, by the Government of New South Wales. He wrote back immediately to say how pleased he was to hear about it. "I like that sort of adventure," he said. So by him finding that framed photo and the letter, Betsy's thanks was to bestow Rex her property. What was the cause of the massacre? Well, in a narrative printed in the Sydney Gazette, it stated that on Boyd's voyage from Sydney, 4 or 5 young Maoris were on board and they were treated badly by Captain Thompson. And that their arrival on the Bay of Islands, they then complained to their relatives and friends at Wangarawa, to the tribe of which they belonged, and then the tribe determined to take revenge and take the ship. In November 1809, Robert Fitz, whom the rebels had made commissary in place of John Palmer on the deposition of Governor William Bligh, was suspended for malversation, or in other words, corruption. Lieutenant Governor William Patterson appointed William Broughton as acting commissary in his place. When Governor Lachlan Macquarie arrived, he restored Palmer to his post, but in March 1810, when Palmer returned to England for the court-martial of Colonel George Johnston, Broughton again was made acting commissary. Macquarie warmly praised Broughton for his diligence and honesty during the 3 years of his control as the commissariat, although he had been harassed by the debts which Fitz had contracted and which Palmer had neglected and made difficult to collect by taking the books to England. Macquarie urged that Broughton's appointment be made permanent, but the British government decided on a new establishment under David Allen. William Broughton married Elizabeth Charlotte Kennedy on the 4th of December 1810. Elizabeth was the daughter of James R. Kennedy of Nettlestead, Kent, and she was born in Kent on the 7th of May 1780. She arrived in Sydney in 1895 with her father, her aunt and 2 sisters after her mother's death in England, and their family was one of the first free settler families. She married Captain Roger Simpson of Parramatta on the 27th of January 1802 at St John's, Parramatta by Samuel Marsden. Elizabeth was listed as Eliza on this certificate, and she seems to use this name for most records throughout her life. The marriage was witnessed by her father and Samuel Marsden's wife. Elizabeth and the captain had one son, Edward Rayworth Simpson, born on the 21st of June 1804 in Sydney. However, this was 1 month after her husband, Captain Simpson, had died. And to give an insight into why her husband died so young, an article mentions, yesterday evening died, after a severe illness of several months, Captain R. Simpson, formerly of the brig Nautilus, an event that cannot fail of exciting universal regret, as social virtues alike contributed to adorn his character. To his adventurous zeal and perseverance in exploring much of the before undelineated track of the extensive Southern Ocean, discovery is in no small degree indebted. The urbanity of his manners were exemplary and engaging, and the philanthropy of his disposition endeared him to society. Edward Simpson was recorded as living at Appin in 1828, with the assumption being that he was brought up as part of the Broughton family after his mother married William Broughton, and he was 6 when they married. Edward Simpson died aged only 28 on the 20th of December 1832 at Campbelltown. So not only was William Broughton bringing up his children from Anne Glassett, after him and Eliza married, they had 5 children together. The first was James Gordon Broughton, who was born in October 1811 in Sydney. He died aged only 21 in Argyle, New South Wales, and he left his will to his mother. The second child, Frances Matilda Broughton, known as Fanny, was born in February 1814 at Campbelltown. She married Benjamin Clayton, a surgeon, at St Peter's, Campbelltown in 1839. They had 8 children, and Fanny died in March 1894 in Burwood, New South Wales, aged 80. The third of their 5 children, Emma Carn Broughton, was born in August 1815 in Campbelltown. She married James Garland in the Church of England at Appin in June 1839. In 1837, James Garland had taken up land at Dubbalara near Tumut, where Emma's 2 brothers had land. James Garland told the story once that 4 desperate scoundrels, armed to the teeth under the leadership of Ben Hall and Main, held up Dr. Clayton at Blowering Station. Mrs. and Miss Broughton, Mrs. Clayton and Mrs. George Shelley, had been sent to Garland's at Dubbalara, where they remained protected at James Garland's in a state of siege for some days, until the robbers were brought down by the police. During this time, romance blossomed between Miss Broughton and James Garland, which resulted in their marriage. Garland's letter concludes, "I never ceased to bless the bushrangers for sending me such a treasure." James Garland became a member of Lachlan. They had 13 children together, and Emma died at Tamworth, New South Wales in February 1893, aged 77. The fourth child was John Archer Broughton, born in December 1818 in Sydney, and there'll be more detail on John in the latter part of the podcast. Their fifth child, Robert Kennedy Broughton, was born on the 6th of September 1820 at Liverpool, New South Wales. In 1837, he joined his brother John in taking up land near Tumut at Gadara on the Gilmore River. They were the first to grow wheat in the district, and this land is still occupied by members of the Broughton family. Robert Broughton was married at Appin in 1845 by Reverend Sparling to Sarah Emma Stein, who was the daughter of Captain John Foster Church and his wife, Barbara Ann George. Sarah was the widow of John Stein, who was a whaling captain, and she spent the first 7 months of her marriage to John Stein with him at sea. On his next trip, he was shipwrecked and survived for 9 months, but only to be killed by the natives. They also had a daughter that they named Eliza George. Sarah, who was deaf and dumb, was known for her sweet and gracious personality. At Sarah's christening, she had been given a bowl, and this was used at the baptism of all of the Broughton children, as well as those of their neighbours. When the church hall was built, 3 of Robert and Sarah's children donated the communion vessels. Sarah must have had lonely times when Robert went off droving cattle. In 1847, Robert wrote a diary of his overland trip to Adelaide, starting from the Murray on the 8th of March and going firstly to Toomer. Robert was an exemplary husband and father and was apparently a man of quiet humour, for he wrote odd poems on subjects which amused him as well as the more serious ones. Robert and his brother John's family maintained a very close relationship over the years. Before John went to Deniliquin, 19 children in 2 families were born in the years from 1844 to 1865, and Robert died at Tumut in September 1876 at the age of 55. And there was a small article. On the 21st at his residence, Gadara, near Tumut, after a very brief illness, died Mr. Robert Kennedy Broughton, youngest son of the late Mr. Assistant Commissary Broughton. The deceased, who was a native of the colony, was one of the earliest settlers in the Tumut district, having some 25 years ago taken up extensive squattages in that quarter in partnership with his brother, Mr. J. A. Broughton, now resident of Deniliquin. The late Mr. Robert Broughton was educated at Mr. Cape's Academy at the same time with Mr. W. Forster and Sir J. Martin. Some 5 or 6 years ago, the deceased was voted by the Legislative Assembly £2,000 as compensation for damage done to his pastoral holdings by free selections made thereon. Mr. Broughton was a man of literary tastes, and on more than one occasion contributed articles to this journal, which were much spoken of as evidencing considerable culture and a general knowledge of all things Australian. And it was in the Yass Courier. So getting back to William Broughton Sr., after his second marriage, in 1811, Broughton had been granted 1,000 acres near Appin. Appin is 71 kilometres southwest of Sydney on the road between Wollongong and Campbelltown. Broughton was made Deputy Assistant Commissary General in June 1813, but on Macquarie's further strong recommendation in 1814, he was promoted Acting Assistant Commissary General at a salary of £365 per annum. In May 1815, William Broughton, who had been the magistrate since November 1809, clashed with Geoffrey Bent when, with Alexander Riley, he wished to allow, temporarily, ex-convict attorneys to appear as agents before the newly established Supreme Court. Bent did not forget this dispute, and in June 1816 had Broughton arrested for contempt when he refused to return a servant who had been legally transferred from Mrs. Ellis Bent's employ to Broughton's. Bent's action was held to be illegal, and in refusing him bail, Bent was said to have behaved in a very ungentlemanly way. And in July 1816, Macquarie sent him to relieve Patrick Hogan at Hobart Town and correct the abuses in the commissariat there. And there's an article that mentions he had the confidence in a very marked degree of those in authority, so much so that when Governor Sorrell was appointed to Van Diemen's Land, Mr. Broughton was appointed as his confidential advisor. And there's a notice in the Hobart in August 1816 saying, "We learn that William Broughton, Esquire, Assistant Commissary General, has arrived at Port Dalrymple on the brig Kangaroo, and he is expected to arrive overland to this settlement on Tuesday next." William Broughton quickly did correct the abuses, so it's not surprising that Edward Lord, who had been trading profitably with the store, charged him with malversation. An inquiry into Broughton's conduct in July 1817 found grounds for a general court-martial, but when Macquarie ordered the witnesses to Sydney, they refused to come, and Judge Advocate Sir John Wilde found Lord's charges frivolous and false. In 1817, William was also appointed as a magistrate in Hobart. In March 1818, Broughton was ordered to resume his duties at Sydney. Macquarie recommended that he should succeed Allen, but again the British government passed him over and appointed Frederick Drennan. Broughton strongly disapproved the promissory notes which Allen and Drennan issued and which Macquarie stopped. Broughton upheld the system of the store receipts, which he'd found very satisfactory in 1810 to 1813, and which Commissioner John Thomas Bigg later approved. Partly because of these commiserate quarrels, Broughton was charged with scandalous and derogatory conduct to Mrs. Allen at a ball. Found guilty at first, he was later acquitted because the Mutiny Act under which he'd been tried was not then applicable to commiserate officers in New South Wales. William Broughton Sr. died on the 22nd of July 1821, less than 12 months after his youngest child Robert was born. He was only 53 and he was buried at St Luke's, Liverpool. Among a motley crowd of dissolute officials, Broughton stands out as a loyal, trustworthy public servant who, as Macquarie reported, performed faithful, honest, useful and arduous service for 30 years, but because he had no powerful patron in London, he was consistently passed over in favour of less competent men. Broughton had given valuable evidence to Bigg on the employment of convict labour, was a large shareholder and briefly had been a director of the Bank of New South Wales and a supporter of the Benevolent Society. Elizabeth remained at their farm, Lachlan Vale, in Appin, and she died on the 20th of December 1843. So coming to their fourth child, Robert Archer Broughton. In 1836, Robert arrived in Tumut and settled at Mundungo and later took up land at Go-Cup he called Riverside. He married Isabel Bingham in Appin, New South Wales on the 1st of June 1843 when he was 24, when Isabel was 16. Isabel was the daughter of Henry Bingham, the Commissioner of Crown Lands and the coroner in the Murrumbidgee district. She was born in March 1827 at Ballyclough Castle, Ireland. Her mother died when she was 3 and her father remarried in Ireland when she was 4 years old. Henry Bingham joined the Inniskilling Dragoons and served in India, reaching the office of colonel before being invalidated out after suffering a total of 47 sabre wounds. For a time he managed the Marquis of Thomas's estate near Cork before coming to Australia in the Lady Macnaghten in 1837. So Henry came out solo and arrived at Port Jackson on the 26th of February 1837. There was an outbreak of typhus on board. 54 passengers had died by the time the ship reached Sydney, and it was mentioned that Henry was appointed Commissioner of Crown Lands by Governor Burke in 1837, and he came to Tumut in 1839 to take charge of all the lands beyond the Murrumbidgee. He built Wallangower Homestead on vacant Crown land and established his border police across the river at Cockatoo. Isabel arrived with her stepmother Penelope on the Canton in 1841, so 4 years after her father had arrived in Australia, and accompanying her was also her brother Robert and half-sister Julia. Mrs. Bingham was known to be very talented and well educated, with a good knowledge of medicine, which she dispensed to the local population until more skilled help could be obtained. And it mentions that Henry Bingham, like Count Strzelecki, discoverer of Mount Kosciuszko, does not figure greatly in the annals of Australian exploration, but he deserves a place there, for he was responsible for the exploration and opening up of all the area under his jurisdiction, reaching as far west as the Edward River and even down to Victoria. He was very active in local affairs, was Gold Commissioner, was instrumental in having the township of Tumut moved above flood level, having been warned by the danger by the Aborigines with whom he was on good terms. He wrote copious letters to Governor Gipps, trying to get the town of Gundagai also moved to a higher level, and it was while helping with the rescues during the disastrous 1852 floods that swept the township away that he caught the pneumonia, which later caused his death. So Isabel's father is buried at Robert's property Riverside at Kogarp. On the 2nd of April 1865, John Broughton was successful in obtaining a position of Clerk of Petty Sessions at Deniliquin, replacing Mr. McKenna. And John came to Deniliquin without his family initially, leaving his wife and 8 children behind so he could establish housing for them. On the 3rd of May 1865, he wrote a letter to his wife from the Royal Hotel lamenting about the lack of housing. John and Isabella Broughton purchased the block of land that was to become Rose Lodge in February 1865, and by August 1866 had built Rose Lodge. In 1868, he was the District Commissioner based at Deniliquin alongside his CPA role in the town. He and Isabel were invited to a party that Alfred Jennings and his wife held at Warbricken in August 1868 that is outlined in more detail in episode 27, The Premier. In 1869, John was a land agent in Deniliquin, and by 1870 he was also the council auditor. In June 1871, Isabel advertised for a general servant, so they obviously were doing very well for themselves, and John was certainly developing a lot of different roles in the town. In January 1872, the servant mentioned earlier, Elizabeth Ramsay, 29 years old, was burnt to death when she was lighting the fire in the kitchen with kerosene. And there was an article in the local paper outlining this event. 13th of January 1872, shocking death from burning by kerosene. On Thursday last at 1 p.m, Elizabeth Ramsay, servant to Mr. J.A. Broughton, clerk of petty sessions at Deniliquin, was lighting the fire when she poured some kerosene onto the wood to assist in rapidly accomplishing her object. The day was very warm, the thermometer nearly 100 degrees in the shade, so around 40 degrees Celsius. The kerosene immediately ignited in the can and the flames burst onto the poor girl, who was forthwith on fire and was fearfully burnt. She was then carried on a stretcher to the hospital where Dr. Wren attended her, but she died in 2 or 3 hours from the burns and the nervous shock. The girl's friends are living in Melbourne. She was about to be married at Deniliquin when she met this frightful death. She seemed cognizant of her awful position. She met her death bravely. She was a very good girl and apparently a fine specimen of the domestic servant. John later was also the stipendiary magistrate of Deniliquin, and he died on Christmas Day 1878 at the home of his daughter and son-in-law Theodore Watson at their home called Ultima in South Yarra, aged 62. And in the Pastoral Times Deniliquin it says, with deep regret we have to record the loss of another of a good, kind and true old resident of this town who has just been removed by death. No one was better known or more respected than Mr. J.A. Broughton, Esquire, CPS, who was now numbered with the great majority. Few indeed are they who would say an unkind word of the departed one. True to his duties, true to his church, true to his friends, and kind to all, especially the children of the Episcopalian Sabbath School, in which for years he took on special delight. His loss here will be deeply felt, and it may be some years before the children will find such an untiring friend. The pastor of that church will also feel the loss of this truly good man. He steadfastly has been true to the various ministers in charge, whose church warden he has been for many years. Everywhere the news of Mr. Broughton's death was cast a shadow of gloom over the festivities of this season, and only one expression was heard, that of regret and of great loss sustained and sympathy for the bereaved family. So he was clearly a very popular man in the town. He was also trustee of the School of Arts. Isabel continued to live at Rose Lodge in Deniliquin until around 1897, and there was an article in 1895 that gave a little insight also into the home. It says the late flower show. The presentation of the first prize medal for the best cottage garden in connection with the late flower show was made during the week, and forwarding the very handsome gold medal to Mrs. J.A. Broughton of Rose Lodge, the secretary of the society sent the following letter. Dear Madam, herewith I have very much pleasure in handing to you the Society's gold medal won by you at our late flower show in October for the best kept cottage garden in Deniliquin. Isabel died at her son-in-law George Campbell Addison's home, they called Riverina, in Ocean Street, Wallara, New South Wales in 1899. John and Isabel had 12 children, 3 of which did not survive into adulthood. Their first child, Henry Bingham Broughton, was born at Cogup near Tumut in January 1845. He married Elizabeth Ann Rees Jones in Yass in December 1869, and he died at Mossman in March 1902, aged 57. and there was an article outlining his death that gave an insight into his life. The late Mr. H.B. Broughton. The Sydney Morning Herald says the late Henry Bingham Broughton JP was a descendant of two of the oldest families in the Commonwealth. His grandfather William Broughton, having been Assistant Commissary General in the early days of the state, while his maternal grandfather Henry Bingham was a Crown Lands Commissioner in the 40s. Mr. Broughton was for many years a grazier in the Temora and Hillston districts, and more recently an auctioneer at Hay, but came to Sydney to reside last year when he joined the Farmers and Settlers Association as a stock salesman. The deceased gentleman was a celebrated rough rider in his younger days, having been bred and born in the Tumut district, close to the source of the Snowy River, made famous by Banjo Patterson. Mr. Broughton was also considered an excellent judge of horseflesh and has recently acted in the capacity at country shows in southern districts. The deceased gentleman leaves a widow, 6 sons and 3 daughters, his 2 eldest sons being managers of Gooley and Welburn stations in the northwestern districts. The second child, John Archer Broughton Jr., was born at Kogarp in June 1847. He died aged 15 of scarlet fever. Their third child, Robert William Broughton, was born at Kogarp in October 1848. He was a bachelor and lived and farmed on a property, Corinya, near Hay, New South Wales, and he died in Toorak, Victoria, at the home called Lineda in January 1911, aged 62. And there was a small article related to his death. It said a feeling of great regret was experienced in the town on Wednesday when news came to hand of the death of Mr. Robert William Broughton, formerly stock inspector, and there was an article also in the Hay newspaper. A feeling of general regret was experienced in the town on Wednesday when the news came to hand of the death of Mr. Robert William Broughton, former stock inspector of this district, which took place on Monday morning suddenly at the residence of his sister, Mrs. Hogg of Toorak. Late Mr. Broughton was the son of the former Clerk of Petty Sessions at Deniliquin. His early days were spent in the Tumut district. Before coming to Hay, Mr. Broughton for a time was manager of Mr. Shanahan and Mr. Jennings's property, Warbricken. He also worked at Wearai Station, so both properties near Deniliquin. The deceased gentleman's first acquaintance with the Hay district was manager of Wollondul Station, at the time the property of his brother-in-law, Mr. Theodore Watson. Afterwards, he brought an interest in Tibera, which he managed, and after that he managed Keewong, in which he also had an interest. He was appointed stock inspector at Hay about 10 years ago. In his early days, he was an accomplished horseman, and his services were often requisitioned as an amateur rider. He made hosts of friends wherever he went by his genial and obliging disposition. Last year, Mr. Broughton resigned the position of stock inspector and retired to his property, Corinya, where he carried out grazing, farming and dairying pursuits on a small scale. The fourth child, Blakeney Broughton, was born in August 1850 at Kogarp. In 1896, he was a magistrate and a stock inspector at Burrawina in New South Wales. He died in March 1911 at Burrawina of heart failure. He was about to take up his brother's property, Corinya, at Hay, after his own brother's death only 2 months prior. He did not marry. Grace Helena Broughton was born in August 1854 at Kogarp. She married Theodore Watson, and he at the time owned Kalimo, property near Deniliquin, in 1872, and she was 18 at that time when they married. They moved to Corowa, where Theo was a stock inspector. Theo died in 1898. They had 3 children, 2 of which survived infancy, and Helena died in Toorak, Victoria in June 1916, aged 61, and she left the proceeds of her will to her spinster daughter, Isabel Rita. The sixth child, Gordon James Broughton, was born at Kogarp in December 1856, and he died there at the age of 5. Their seventh child, Isabel Gertrude Broughton, known as Ida, was born at Kogarp in June 1859. She married George Logue Dixon in Deniliquin at St Paul's in June 1882. And there was a detailed article outlining their wedding in the Pastoral Times on the 3rd of June 1882. A large congregation of spectators was attracted to St Paul's Church on Thursday morning to witness the solemnisation of marriage between Mr G. L. Dixon of Uabba and Mass Hope stations in the Lachlan district and Urani station in South Australia, son of the late Dr Dixon, to Miss Isabella Gertrude Broughton, second daughter of the late G. A. Broughton of Deniliquin. Punctually at 12 o'clock, The bride and bridegroom presented themselves at the communion rails, and the impressive service was recited by the Reverend H.E. Taylor. The contracted parties, together with the witnesses, then adjourned to the vestry and the necessary certificates were signed. From the vestry, the newly married couple walked down the south aisle between the two rows of densely packed spectators, many of whom deposited bouquets of flowers and bunches of evergreens as the happy pair, followed by their immediate friends and relations, left the church. The bridesmaids were 9 in number and included the Mrs. Mabel, Frances and Beatrice Broughton, sisters of the bride, and 2 tiny daughters of Mrs. Theodore Watson, nieces of the newly married lady. The couple lived in Melbourne, George being listed in the 1906 census as a squatter. In 1887, they were living at St Kilda in a home that they called Warora on Dandenong Road. They had 3 children. 1, Violet, survived infancy. Ida died at Toorak, Victoria in December 1936, aged 77, and her probate was registered in London. The 8th child was a stillborn boy, born at Kogup in 1861. The 9th child, Lachlan Wentworth Broughton, was born in June 1861 at Kogup, quite possibly a twin. He married Susan Williams at Yass in 1887. Lachlan was a civil servant who served as the clerk of petty sessions in Deniliquin like his father did in 1883. Their family home in Deniliquin was Croydon's Cottage, and they also lived in Harris Park and Mossman. He died in September 1942 at Mossman, aged 81. They had 2 sons, Gordon Wentworth Broughton, who was born in Deniliquin in 1888 and fought in World War I. He married Jessie Emily Clark at Sandringham in Victoria in April 1921, and they had 2 children. He was a surveyor who worked on the Murray River locks and Wangala Dam in the 1920s and was employed by the New South Wales Irrigation Commission. And Gordon died on the 3rd of November 1967. The other son, Gerald, was born in Tamworth in 1891 and he died at Palana, Cootamundra, aged 17 in 1909. The 10th child, Mabel Broughton, who was born at Kogup in July 1863. She married William Edward Hogg, an English-born groom merchant from Melbourne, at St Paul's Church in Deniliquin in April 1889. There was an article in the Deniliquin Pastoral Times outlining their wedding. The marriage of Miss Mabel Broughton, 3rd daughter of the late John Archer Broughton of Deniliquin, to Mr. William E. Hogg of the firm Hogg, Robinson and Co., merchants of Melbourne, was celebrated last week in the Church of England by the Reverend G.B. Holt. It attracted a large gathering. She was attended by Mrs. Frances and Beatrice Dawson, who were most elaborately attired for the occasion. The bride was given away by her brother, Mr. Blakeney Broughton. They had 2 children, and Mabel died in Toorak, Victoria in August 1918. Frances Kennedy Broughton, the 11th child born in the family, was the first child born at Rose Lodge in August 1866. She married Arthur Charles Ebsworth at Wallara, New South Wales in April 1903. She was 36 and Arthur 42. Arthur was a solicitor and they had 3 daughters. Frances died in December 1946 at Wallara, aged 80. Beatrice Emma Broughton was the last child to be born in the family in June 1869 at their family home Rose Lodge in Deniliquin. Beatrice was known as Bird to her family. Beatrice married George Campbell Addison, a barrister in Deniliquin. George was 7 years older than Beatrice. And there is some more information about George Campbell Addison. It says he was born in Sydney on the 7th of October 1862. He went to Singleton and Sydney Grammar Schools and Sydney University. He was a barrister at law, assistant parliamentary draftsman, industrial registrar, chairman of industrial boards, chief industrial magistrate since May 1912, and a member of the first New South Wales Rugby Union football team against New Zealand in 1882. So quite a notable marriage, which also had an article. Addison Broughton. The marriage of Mr. George Campbell Addison, second son of Mr. Glentworth Addison, stipendiary magistrate Sydney, and brother of Mr. Glentworth Addison, CPS at Yass, with Miss Beatrice Broughton, youngest daughter of Mrs. Broughton, Rose Lodge, Deniliquin, New South Wales, took place at St Paul's Church, Deniliquin on Wednesday, March 18. Archdeacon Holt officiated. The bride was given away by her eldest brother, Mr. H.B. Broughton. The 2 bridesmaids were Miss Fran Broughton, sister of the bride, and Miss Violet Dixon, niece of the bride. They had 2 children, Hope and Campbell. The family sailed from London in 1823. They lived at Bellevue Hill, Woodlara, and this is where Beatrice died in September 1932, aged 63. And an interesting picture that was in the Sydney Mail in 1917. It shows a picture of William Broughton and his direct descendants, all of which fought in World War I. Very interesting, and you'll notice that there are the names of some that I have mentioned. So please tune into my bonus episode and you will find out all about the Wise family and their contributions that they had to the town of Deniliquin as well.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes